Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, and indeed I work quite closely with Mohammed Ibrahim Shiri, so hopefully this will follow on quite nicely from his presentation. I do hope that whilst this is East Africa focused, a lot of what I talk about will be relevant beyond the region and looking at how we can all be working better together moving forward in this context of reduced funding. There's been a lot of discussion this week of the word integration, people using it in all sorts of different ways. Others have spoken about the need for interdisciplinary action, and others sort of a whole of society approach. But it's rarely really clear how we can actually work better together in practical terms. And under the Deris Wanag project, which I'll introduce towards the end of this presentation, we wanted to explore the need for better integration of approaches, why it's so challenging, and ultimately what it entails in practice. In particular, I think this relates quite nicely with what Deakin University were talking about yesterday in the breakout session and their Do No Harm toolkit, the idea that development actors and humanitarians also need to be recognizing drivers of recruitment and the potential for exacerbating the problem. So hopefully some of what I talk about will bring a lot of the themes from this week together. PCV has traditionally focused on the most at-risk individuals. You might, for example, build employability through mentorship, but if there are no jobs available at a structural level in the community, then limited progress can be made by creating greater employability amongst individuals. And all policymakers face this challenge, which is responding to interconnected, often structural issues, while demonstrating a tangible impact on a very specific threat, in our case normally terrorism, or violent extremism. And this conference has repeatedly raised this issue. Do we work with individuals, or do we work with the structural grievances affecting whole communities? So we, in conducting this sort of policy brief, it wasn't sort of pure research, it's sort of a policy brief largely drawing on our experience on the project, but also on other PCV initiatives across East Africa and the Horn. There is a bit of a literature review, there was a series of roundtables conducted and some KAIs, but it's not sort of pure research. But yeah, the timing of this study really coincides with the funding crisis that we're all dealing with. Development actors, humanitarians, PCV security actors are all sort of competing for this reduced pool of funds. And this ultimately, I think, provides an opportunity to reimagine how we design our programs. At the same time, it could also lead to greater competition. So it's really a key time to consider these issues. The sort of short study also coincided with lessons towards the end of our project, towards the end of Deris Wanag, and finally historic sort of struggles in really proving the success of PCV in sort of recent years. So firstly, I want to sort of phrase, and hopefully this addresses the question of radicalization in the region, frame the problems we're dealing with using a systems approach. So the vast majority of violent extremism globally occurs within conflict zones. So I think we've sort of maybe not addressed enough of the sort of conflict within which VE exists during this session. And indeed, the Global Terrorism Index in their reports over the last decade, for I think since 2015, at least 95% of terrorism deaths have occurred within war zones year on year. So this is where the vast majority of this activity is happening. And violent extremism is really enmeshed within and enabled by that broader conflict system. It's rarely even ever the defining component of that system of instability. It's really a symptom or propellant rather than the underlying cause of the threat, of the instability. Violent extremism and conflict ultimately are mutually transformative processes, and it can be really difficult, as you can see in the graph here, which is all activity in our project area since the start of the project 3 years ago. It can be very difficult to delineate between the extremism, the Al-Shabaab attacks, and the crime, the communal violence, the security force violence. And that has real policy implications. Violent extremism in our part of the world, as Mohammed has already explained, is attractive to many due to limited economic opportunities, broken social contracts, ethnic, social, religious divisions, but it exists within other forms of violence, as we see in this map. And in this context, AQ groups and Islamic State-aligned groups are able to get involved in social and political networks and establish their own legitimacy in the ways which we've heard this morning. UNDP describes this as, describes jihadists in the region as grievance entrepreneurs. They merely exploit existing local development deficits. So the assumption amongst policymakers which sees violent extremism as parasitic or co-opting and reshaping existing conflict is problematic. We need to also recognize that it goes the other way. Violent extremist groups are themselves part of this system and are shaped by existing settings, norms, social networks, and other forms of violence which they exist alongside. So it's not purely about, obviously, external indoctrination. Violent extremist groups need to be understood through the lens of these local cultural norms, power structures, and social dynamics, and ultimately understood as part of a system rather than isolation. And in this context, that really means that pure PCV initiatives have ultimately not been fit for purpose. It's widely accepted, as we've heard all week, that radicalization is a dynamic process affecting everyone in different ways, in infinite different combinations of ways, at the group, the individual, and structural level. But PCV, in our region at least, has too often become a catch-all category with limited strategic or practical utility. It's often far too focused on monocausal explanations, poverty, in the case of lots of governments in the region, or ideology. It's also become too focused on at-risk individuals and ultimately really reductive. So what I'm trying to say is that if we understand the challenges we're responding to, as in our case terrorism, as part of a system, then we need to understand how different parts of that system interact in specific places in specific ways, as Mohammed said, very, very localized ways to create violence. And we need to reconsider how we respond to each component of that system. Tackling micro-level, meso-level, macro-level drivers of instability as we do so. And this means that counterterrorism, PCV, must be nested within and linked up with other intervention approaches to sort of maximize complementarity. We argue that in this funding crisis, as I said, it's better now to really reconsider how we can integrate, how we can move together a lot of our different approaches that we've talked about this week. It's more important than ever, but also it's increasingly we're seeing the opposite happening. We're seeing donors more and more isolated, siloed in their approaches and their funding streams. Different interventions involving state, international partners, civil society, religious traditional authorities, the private sector, can work together using their comparative advantages on different parts of that system that we've talked about. And we obviously recognize that no PCV initiative can tackle the whole system alone. And what I'm talking about isn't really new at all. People have spoken about holistic approaches for a long time, mainstreaming PCV or PCV sensitivities within other programming, but it's not really making a difference to date. So we see PCV programs, security sector reform initiatives, stabilization initiatives, governance initiatives, all existing in the same locations, not cooperating, not collaborating, and that has been the case in the Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia borderlands historically. All those sort of security sector initiatives are often isolated from development work and isolated completely from humanitarian initiatives as well. Of course, we're not suggesting this is easy. The longest section of this report that resulted from this is the challenges. So it's this is by no means an easy solution. There's two main categories of challenges. I won't go through them all today, but conceptually, What are we actually integrating? Everyone has different understandings. Are we trying to integrate approaches, say coercive, non-coercive approaches, or the humanitarian peace-building development nexus, the HPD nexus that people talk about? Are we trying to integrate funding streams within donor governments? Are we trying to bring together different donors or different sectors of society? How we understand what integration is really influences how interventions are conceived, structured, and delivered. But we really argue that all these different understandings should coexist and be tied together at programming, policy, strategy, and system-wide levels. But it's the practical challenges that are arguably more significant. These different approaches I've been talking about, particularly development, humanitarianism, and sort of peace-building approaches, let alone the different elements of security responses, have really different assumptions. They're based on different mechanics, audiences, risk appetites, and really subtly different objectives and theories of change. They have different budgets and timelines, which makes collaboration, deconfliction really challenging. And they have different work cultures. So everyone, including a lot of us in this room, are very protective of our own funding streams, of our own specialisms. We create our own guilds around what we do. I like this concept of guilds was raised by the UK's development director for Somalia, who's said that these guilds literally don't understand what one another is talking about, and he's sort of battling with that on a daily basis. The challenge which has already come up this week is the sort of securitization of development and humanitarian work. Humanitarians rarely want to work alongside security actors. And ultimately, what we're talking about is really time-consuming. But, and I'm hopefully in the final couple of slides, we'll demonstrate that it is possible, and some coordination is always better than none. So the project which I work on is called Deraswanag. There's numerous lessons of how some of these coordination challenges can be overcome. As already explained, this is a project which is implemented within the Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia borderlands. The idea of working in borderlands is particularly important in a PCV context because borders are really central to the very notion of what it means to be a nation state and to build social contracts. It's a 3-year project that's coming to an end. We're funded by the UK's Integrated Security Fund, but also by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And really, we don't define ourselves in any way as a PCV initiative, although we have a lot of PCV people within the project. We combine development, security, humanitarian, and peace-building approaches, but we're also able to apply each of these approaches at different parts of the border as appropriate, responding to community priorities. We have a very broad objective to build stability, which might sound vague and generic, but it really allows us to be flexible and to bring together different approaches. The consortium who are implementing this project, RUSI as a think tank, Adam Smith International as a sort of development consultancy, and the Danish Refugee Council as humanitarians, is itself really unusual to bring together those sort of entities within the consortium of a project. We deconflict and collaborate with other initiatives, including the EU's projects through the likes of Mohammed here. We work alongside UK Stratcom's work projects. We work with other sort of EU initiatives and regularly present and share information. We link civil society and the state through our grants. We sort of work with one grant to provide ID cards, which is a notorious problem on the Kenya borderlands, to communities in Lamu. We co-create with the state where we can, and we respond to sort of basic needs alongside providing capacity building and dialogue, recognizing that you can't provide training to people who are in the middle of a drought or flooding. You need to, at the same time, be providing to their immediate needs. Everything we do is based on context monitoring, on political economy analysis, which allows us to sort of think and work politically with the grain and separate that political economy from the conflict economy. We also have, treat Jesse very seriously, very centrally to the project. So inclusion is really critical, and our M&E methodologies are fluid, adjusted iteratively, and a coordination is ultimately incentivized through the results frameworks that we use as the projects. So with our team, we're able to break down these guilds that we've been talking about. Very briefly on this very complicated, horrible-looking diagram, we have coordination at various stages. This was my attempt to try and explain how our project works in diagrammatic form. We have a consortium with mixed skills, which uses ongoing research and analysis, prioritizing local opinions to inform decisions over which actors, the guys in yellow on the screen, are used to carry out which sort of combinations of various activities, ultimately to combat drivers collectively of violent extremism and to build stability. And throughout, we're engaging with state actors, with other programs, and sharing evidence, deconflicting and sequencing our interventions as we go. So a few recommendations to conclude. I can speak a lot at length afterwards to anyone who's interested, but at a real minimum, deconfliction is obviously a really important part of this, but it really is only the start of what integration should be all about. The avoidance of duplicated efforts, spending the same money in the same places is happening all over the world. But secondly, integration needs to begin with identifying objectives at the highest level possible, ultimately between donors, policymakers, and beneficiary recipient countries as early as possible so that we can align timelines, align theories of change where possible. Thirdly, we need active and deliberate efforts to break down the guilds and align strategic objectives. That's, to my experience, a lot of that depends on humanitarians being a bit more open to working with other actors. Fourthly, we need to consider sequencing very seriously to ensure our programs are sustainable, waiting maybe for another program to implement before you step in. Fifthly, we need to be much more flexible and agile, and that needs to be incentivized through M&E frameworks. Next, we need to prioritize collaboration with state agencies, overcoming some ethical challenges, of course. Seventh, we need to design collaboration and adaptation must be based on comprehensive context analysis, which should be the basis for everything you do. 8, we need to consider the principles of conflict-sensitive development and adopt a violence, extremist-sensitive approach in all our decision-making. Team composition is critical, as I said, within the consortium. And finally, Jesse needs to be baked into every decision. So there's just some emerging thoughts on how we can more practically start thinking about integrating our programming better. Thank you very much.